My name is Justin Gage, and you're tuned in to the Aquarium Drunkard Transmissions podcast with your host, Jason Woodbury.
Welcome back. I'm Jason, your host. It's great to have you here. My guest this week on the show is guitarist and archivist Nathan Salsburg. I've talked with Nathan a handful of times for Aquarium Drunkard. You can go back into the archives and check that out. But this is the first time that he's been on the podcast, and we're really glad to have him here. His new album is called Psalms, and it features folk arrangements of the Hebrew Psalms sung in Hebrew and English, as well as collaborations with folks like James Elkington, Will Oldham, Joan Shelley, and Spencer Tweedy, among others. It's a really incredible album, very, very beautiful and moving, and it was a really good time to sit down with Nathan to talk about not only this new collection, but also his ideas about preserving music and what kind of legacy we leave behind in terms of recordings. So it was great to have Nathan on. I'm a huge fan of his work. I'm a huge fan of his playing. So without further ado, why don't we head into my conversation with Nathan Salsburg. You can check out Psalms on No Quarter Records, one of the best labels out there, and listen to it wherever you listen to music, and go track down a copy at a record store. It's a great album, really beautiful, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to support Aquarium Drunkard, you want to support what we're doing here on the podcast, head over to our Patreon and check things out. We are supported primarily by our contributors over there, so head over, check it out if you dig what we're doing at Aquarium Drunkard, and I'll speak with you a little bit more on the other side. All right, well, we're rolling. Thanks for taking the time, man. I appreciate it. How are the goats? How many goats do you have?
We have two goats, who, in over the course of COVID year, we got a cat and then 20 chickens and then two goats, and we're down to 12 chickens now. But we also have a human baby as of last month. So the chickens are doing okay with it. The goats are definitely experiencing the decrease in involvement from us.
Yeah.
So I try to check in on them. We also have a dog, but he's a lifer. He's been around for a long time. So we're trying to, I try to give the goats my attention as best I can whenever I have it available.
Yeah. Well, I was curious, because I know that you and your partner Joan have a new baby, Talia. Are either of you getting much sleep these days, or are these pretty sleepless nights lately?
We're actually we're doing okay. I mean, we have a pretty good schedule going, whereby I'm basically kind of up, or I'm sleeping in the room with her between like 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., waking up Joan when Talia gets hungry. And then Joan takes over before dawn, and then I'm able to sleep until about, 10. So I think between the two of us, we're pulling down like 6-7 hours of sleep, in chunks, but we're getting, we're doing okay. I mean, I say that now, I'm saying that on the record, and that's an absolute like guaranteed jinx. So maybe I should say that was total bullshit. I've totally made it up. It's awful. We're not sleeping at all. We're tearing our hair out. Yeah. But no, we're really doing okay. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. I mean, it's always, I don't have any children myself, but I've been around plenty of children, and I know that infants, It's not always a guarantee that people are getting rest, but I'm really glad that the two of you are. It seems, from the outside at least, fairly idyllic in terms of your situation out there with the wildlife and the infant and everything else.
and the domestic life. Yeah, there's a pretty fine membrane between the wildlife and the domestic life here. But we're really lucky. I mean, we live on some land a half an hour from Louisville, and we got to, we're able to spend 2020 out here, super isolated. The satellite internet isn't the best, so that's why I'm still kind of a Zoom naive, which is also a blessing in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. For you, trust me.
Yeah, right, totally. But yeah, we're super, super lucky, and we're constantly counting our blessings on that front. Most definitely.
Yeah. I'm curious, with a new baby in the house, what records have you and Joan been playing? Have you been playing anything to sort of soundtrack this really beautiful and the first month of Talia's life?
It's a great question, and I actually tried to keep a listening log going for I think it lasted like 2 weeks, and then it just became, I mean, I was writing down the artist and the song and or record and the format, and I was like, the fuck am I, she won't give a shit.
Yeah.
She won't care now, she won't care in 10 years, she won't care in 40 years.
Yeah,
so I stopped doing that. I mean, listening to her, it's been, there are some things that we sort of planned, some things that we listened to with her in utero, like Harry Nilsson's The Point, which is, one of my all-time favorite records from me being a kid.
Yeah.
We sang her that song, Think About Your Troubles, as a lullaby when she was still in utero. And that's still one that we keep close and use basically every night. So that record's been in pretty constant rotation. But the things that we've had this conversation with people who are like, oh, what kids records do you have? We've had some kids records recommendations. And I'm, honestly, she's still young enough that you don't have to distinguish between kid and adult records now. But I also wonder if you ever have to do that. I mean, there are so many wonderful records ostensibly made for adults that are so fun for kids. Like Jake Fussel's records are super fun for kids. Or super fun for just sort of being childlike with a baby. She definitely likes to be danced around. So we've listened to a lot of roots reggae. We've listened to Paul Simon's Rhythm of the Saints, which is a great record for kids. Talking Heads Remain in Light is another one. Great, dancing start to finish. I put on just sort of did a quick playlist of 90s hip hop last week, listened to Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Ice Cube, and Bones, Thug and Harmony, and Thugs and Harmony, and that went really well. Basically, whenever you can keep up some movement too. But we go out every morning, and I have an office in a barn here where I keep all my records. We'll go make a coffee. I'll play some 78s. We'll dance around. Hawaiian music has gone over pretty well. Klezmer's gone over pretty well, just in terms of being able to keep up some kind of physical movement that she seems engaged with. So It really is, you ask, obviously I have a long answer to that question, but it's been such a joy. Just not so much introducing records to her because she doesn't care, but the experience of experiencing music with this tiny human in movement has been just like what a incredible gift and such a joy.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. That sounds wonderful. And I mean, she has obviously very, very cool parents who have good taste and all that. But I always think about, because I'll have friends who are like, I feel like I have this responsibility to teach my kid what to listen to or things like that. And to me, I don't have kids, so I know I shouldn't, make any sort of value judgments or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's a big part of me that just thinks like, I think all you have to do is maybe teach your kid how to listen to music or the importance of it, and from there, they'll take care of it from there. They don't need mom and dad to explain it. You know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe that's just my naive non-experienced version of it. But at the same time, I do think about how I'll remember some of the songs that I heard as a very, very young kid, just at sort of the dawn of my memory. And whether or not you ever make the decision, this song is important to me. That's not really how it works. It's just sort of like in your head,
Absolutely.
There's this, the JJ Cale song, Magnolia. I think that might be one of the first songs I remember hearing. Not his version. My dad was into a guitarist named Pat Travers, who's kind of like a blues rock dude, but he does this version. He does this version of Magnolia that's like so cool, like very flanged guitar. And so, I guess a couple, 7 or 8 years ago, I was listening to that Lee Fields record, and he covered it, and I had this like wild association with. Like I felt this intense wave of feeling, and I was like, what the heck? This is nuts. And then I realized, like, oh, that's probably one of the first songs that entered your brain in a sort of concrete way. So it's like, I think it's cool to imagine what kind of associations and memories and sort of sense she'll have of this time in her life. It's just such a fascinating and exciting thing.
That's a very cool story, because it's obvious that you had no recollection of the particular performance. It was just the melody that stuck with you. So you could have probably heard J.J. Cale's, or, actually Joan has recorded a version of Magnolia.
I know,
on one of her records. That's actually was on one of our birth playlists that we never got around to listening to because it all happened so quickly. But there's so many versions of that song, so many versions of songs that we loved as children, but we don't need to hear the particular performance that maybe our parents would have said, well, this is the one you need to know because we like this artist. We don't like this artist who did a much, inferior version. It doesn't matter to you because you just have the very basics, the rudiments of the song in your memory. That's all you need to have it recalled. Right? Yeah.
And it's funny the way it gets stuck in there so deep sometimes that you never would even have necessarily known to point it out. But when you feel it, that's what's, this actually is as nice of a segue as any into talking about your great new record, the Psalms, which, so this was one that you record. Did you record this out in the barn office studio area?
Some of it, this was kind of underway the whole project was underway for 5 years or so, but the recording started in early 2019. So all of the meat of my tracks, the meat of my contribution to the record, my singing, guitar playing, all happened. We have a very dear old friend named Zach Riles who runs a fantastic studio a county over out here outside of a town called Shelbyville. He and his wife run a farm and he's built a phenomenal studio that we have used the past couple of years for all kinds of projects. And I did my tracking at Zach's in early 2019 with the idea that over the course of that year and into 2020, I would, solicit other people's contributions, go to Chicago, get some stuff done there. Of course, and even the best of times, these things take a long time. So I was able to do everything here in Kentucky, not at home, but at a decent studio. And then because our studio arrangement is only very just acceptable. And then early in 2020, just before everything shut down in early March, I was able to go to Chicago, where the rhythm tracks were done. Spencer Tweedy's drums and Nick McCree's bass, with Jim Elkington involved at a studio in Chicago. And that was everything that we were able to do in studio proper. Everything else was done in people's homes, or if they had access to studios where they were over the rest of, the wildness of 2020. So luckily, I was able to do everything in a somewhat arguably professional manner before COVID descended.
This one took a couple of years to sort of come together, but I was curious if it felt like it was, the sort of thing where even when a project can be difficult, it can still sort of feel like there's like a momentum to it that's moving it along. And I wondered if that's what you felt while you were assembling this one.
Yes, that's a good question. I feel like with this particular record, I have a problem of being goal-oriented, in particular, thinking about, I'll work through with my guitar records in the past. I've, full admission, I'll sort of make weight, I'll get to 35 minutes and be like, oh, I've got the record. Maybe with one or two songs to work with, some float. But I tend to be really, I think, negatively focused on the product, on the, the manifestation of the thing. With this record, because it did take the practice itself of opening the psalm book, flipping around for texts that seem compelling, copying them over both Hebrew and English, and then starting to kind of weave melodies around them. That process, it could be difficult at times, but it was such a joyful and fulfilling practice that at first didn't seem difficult. It wasn't, the difficulty wasn't really in, the idea wasn't about compiling these into an album. Every day I wasn't thinking about, okay, the album needs this thing needs to happen for the sequence to work. I'm going to get this instrument to play here. It wasn't, the arrangements it was very solitary, It was very meditative, and in that, it was it was a real balm to me.
Yeah.
So questions of ease and difficulty weren't really applicable to this. Once we actually started working on the thing, in terms of tracking, then it became considerably more difficult. But it really was, for me, it was it was a meditative experience that I had been hungry for a long time, and didn't really realize just how, this could have gone on forever, but I did end up reaching a point where I said, I'm really happy with, say, the 8 songs that I have here, 9 songs that I have here. This would work for me as a reflection of this several year process. This would be, to me, an ample representation of my experience and of my practice. And we'll make the record now. So it was not as nice not approaching it fundamentally as, okay, how are we going to make this record soup to nuts?
Yeah. So it developed over the course of a few years, I think. So you said you started recording it in 2019. You sort of started working on the arrangements and the, sort of figuring out the way you were going to lay out the lyrics, the psalms themselves that you quote from. Obviously, 2016 to 2019 into 2020. I mean, we're talking about a pretty difficult time, and you use the term balm. So I wonder, what was it in as far as that sort of drew you back into the songs, the Psalms? What kind of relationship did you have with the text prior to starting this project?
I had very little relationship with the text, with the Psalms at all. My experience with Judaism and with Jewish music has, in terms of being a participant, has always been collective, from being a kid at synagogue, for being a slightly older kid at summer camp. The singing of Jewish music has always been a collective experience. And particularly at summer camp, I went to Jewish summer camp for 4 years or something. And, when one sings a Jewish, whether as a liturgical hymn or a more recent Israeli or Eastern European folk song that's been sort of set to vigorous, robust, strummed folk arranged guitar, sing with with big lusty voices, and everyone's booming out in the cafeteria. And it is obviously it's sort of, it's built to pack an emotional punch that it certainly delivered. It was very powerful for me as a 12-year-old. But, we're coming into adulthood and having no Jewish community to speak of and no Jewish practice to speak of, but wanting some kind of engagement, and hopefully something, spiritually minded, something, not an observance per se, but some kind of connection to be made. I first went back to liturgical hymns that I remembered from synagogue, and some of which, had been sort of arranged for summer camp singing. And they didn't really do it for me because I was singing them alone, whereas I remembered them being sung collectively. And it sort of lit on me that what I should do was look into the Psalms, because the Psalms are obviously songs that, were sung, if you believe the myth, or if you don't, they were initially sung by a single voice. They have had synagogue use and collective uses, but they are the kind of thing that an individual can, the idea is that you can go to them and find succor, find solace in them, in all kinds of life experiences. And they've been used as such for a very long time now. So for me, I was like, well, this would be a great way to kind of, familiarize myself with the Psalms, where I never really had an experience with, at the same time of finding some kind of creative raw material there that I can turn to my use. So it definitely did that. I mean, absolutely. And what I kind of I knew in the back of my head, but wasn't familiar with quite to the extent that I am now, is that the Psalms really do, a fundamental part of them is the psalmist is enjoining the listener to sing a new song, or the psalmist is basically calling upon him or herself to sing a new song unto God. And that's what I was looking for. That's what I was trying to do, without sort of realizing that the Psalms would be the sites, would be the place where I would be told to do that and be given sort of the raw material to do it with. So it was a interesting meta creative experience once I started fooling around in them. Of course, there was a lot of material that I jettisoned. There's a lot of smiting of enemies, a lot of, smashing of skulls, and well, that's not so much skulls, but a lot of blood, a lot of smiting, a lot of crushing. And that stuff was very easy to omit for the sake of what really ended up being a lot of, material about making songs and about communing with the eternal, which is exactly the thing that I was after.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think, what sense do you have of the personal circumstances that inspired that want and that need on your part to sort of connect to something that was, a representation of the eternal, of sort of, it sounds like you were interested in some transcendence, basically.
Yeah, I was a little hungry for transcendence, I suppose.
Yeah.
I don't. It's a great question. I mean, a lot of Cynthia Ozick said about her Judaism, that her Judaism was text. That she read, she wrote, and that was basically the extent of her Jewish experience. And of course, I'm sure if you pressed her on that, she would elaborate and say not entirely. But for me, that was my experience. And I, as an adult, again, someone who has not been to synagogue really in any meaningful way in many years, again, didn't really have a community to speak of, was thinking about trying to introduce some sort of observance into my life. And since then, Joan and I have done that. Joan's not Jewish, but she's been, over the past year and a half, we've been, celebrating Shabbat, lighting the candles and having the wine. And I shut down everything. Personally, I turn my phone off from Friday night to Saturday night, which is whether you are Jewish, whether you are Jain, wherever you're coming from, taking a day to shut your shit down is strongly recommended. I mean, it's been a real treat, especially over the past year. But so for me, that was before I started introducing any of that observance back into my life. I was looking for something to reconnect me with this, at the time, which really was just a vague sense of my spiritual identity, I guess. So much of our experience as American Jews is this sort of faux ethnic. And I didn't have that around in Kentucky. I mean, my Jewish family was all from northeastern Pennsylvania, and most of them have died out. And apart from my experience, as a kid in summer camp and at synagogue, I didn't have that as an adult. So it was trying to find some kind of new, meaningful connection to that sense of myself that had kind of atrophied over the years. And, I was a little allergic to the idea of a spiritual practice. But this really opened the possibilities to me, and made me feel like I could be an actor, and not just kind of an actor, a pawn, not just sort of a casual observer or face in the butt in the seats in the synagogue,
Right. Yeah, it's like, it's funny that as somebody who I didn't grow up, I'm not Jewish, by birth. I'm American, and I grew up very in a very fundamentalist Christian church, so my experience with the Psalms, like I think about how the Old Testament is full of really fascinating stuff, as is the New Testament. But I think the Psalms, to me, they were one of my favorite books in the Bible as a kid, because I like the audacity of the psalmist a lot. The psalmist very often seems unafraid to sort of, I don't know, almost like cajole God. There's almost like this like ranting quality to some of them. There's obviously so much variety in it. There are these beautiful songs of praise, and this idea of singing a new song is, an eternally moving and sort of transformative idea. And then, like you said, there's a lot of smiting and a lot of enemies getting crushed and a lot of stuff that, I read the interview that you did for Jewish Current. You talked about how in Psalm 47, you skipped over the line about, God crushes his people beneath us and nations beneath our feet and all that stuff. So obviously there's like a certain kind of reckoning with a lot of the language, but at the same time, as somebody who had not spent a lot of time in the Psalms, were you sort of surprised by their thematic variety and by the sort of the wideness of expression in you book?
Yes, that's very well said. That's a great description of, the purported psalmist. And I really kind of had no idea. And of course, as you move along, getting past the sort of familiar, we have such King James Psalms are really a fundamental part of our experience, just as listeners and readers in America, sort of Anglo culture. I mean, that stuff is really thread do. And certainly, I have experienced the Psalms as you have, maybe more so in, through the music of Pentecostal holiness churches and, recordings made by people like Alan Lomax in the 50s and 60s and earlier of Psalms, the Psalm settings in the, what came out of the Great Awakening and camp meeting hymns and all of that. I mean, that stuff is, it found such a home in those white pioneer, Protestant hymns. So I was more familiar with those than I was, with the Hebrew texts and with the ways they've been translated in various Jewish usages. But absolutely. And now, in a way, I feel like I didn't do justice at all to the diversity of the psalmist's perspective or perspectives, because I just kind of found what I needed in the moment. But certainly, I mean, if I had it in me to do more of these, which I probably don't, you could do so much with them. There's so many avenues that you could take that address so many corners of spiritual yearning. And that figure of that, the psalmist cajoling God, I think of Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. Like, that is such an archetype kind of in Eastern European Jewish folklore too, like the man haranguing God for treating him this way and not it is such an archetype. And so that was certainly, I was surprised to find him there because he was very familiar to me, but from a totally different, much more recent, of a much more recent vintage.
Yeah. Yeah. But I am, so it's interesting to me that I find there to be so much value and beauty and utility in what you're talking about, which is saying, like, you went through and you picked the stuff that was resonant with you, right? I mean, that's sort of the way you went about it. There wasn't like a sort of like a plan of attack where you're like, I'm going to get this one and cover this one. You were just sort of wandering into the text and just looking for what spoke to you, right? Was that a fair way to describe sort of the way
exactly? Yeah, it was so completely subjective. Yeah, I mean, it was, and there really was no sense of what I was going to find. I knew what I was looking for vaguely, but no real sense of what I was going to find. And for me, that was, again, that was core to the experience, core to the practice, especially because so much of what I remember of, Jewish devotional singing was, the sense of things being found and being delivered or reiterated as opposed to things being sought and things being hidden. And, and obviously so much of organized religion is that things are, one of the translations I used for the work is a modern Orthodox translation, and there are glosses on almost every single line, and they're laughably, how do I say this in a politic way? They're laughably reductive. They really don't give you, there's very little room, if any, for analysis, for disagreement. It's basically like, well, this is what the psalmist means here because this is what God does. Yeah. Period. And, that was no interest or use to me. But, I was more interested in, the idea of seeking and finding was so much more interesting to me than being, than coming at it with a sense of like, oh, this is what is going to be revealed to me. And this is what I have to work with to make this coherent or make it make sense to me or anyone else.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that the earnestness of the seeking is what you're talking about there, which is to say that you were open to revelation, basically. You can't go in expecting what you can't go in, well, I guess you can, right? You can do whatever you want, but...
People do it all the time, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's partially why this becomes so difficult to discuss in so many ways, because you're dealing with, I think that there's an unfortunate tendency among religious, adherents of all faiths, really, to suggest that their interpretation is not their interpretation, but rather just simply the transcendent truth that cannot be, danced around. And I don't know, like, so much of the music that you hear in the Alan Lomax Archive, which you work with, or so much just music in general, you hear that conviction of the faith come through in a way that's so moving and so powerful and so expressive. So I like that, I like conviction in music. And yet I also find myself drawn to, I'm going to make my version of this now. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to build an assemblage that works for me. and it doesn't need to work for you, you know? And so I think that there's something interesting about that, because this isn't so much of your work engages with the past, but there's a powerful sense of the present on this record too, because you're making this something, you know, you're making this a new song, and you're singing a new song as somebody who doesn't usually sing on records, you know? So that's like a whole other element to it.
Yeah, that was something that I sort of didn't see coming necessarily. I mean, I knew I was going to sing on it, but I thought maybe I would have someone else do a lot of the singing, if not most of the singing, or other people.
Sure.
And I do want to say too that you're talking about, you know, the conviction or maybe the sense of certainty that comes across in a lot of sacred music. And I do think, you know, we think about obviously, you know, people like Son House, people like Ira Leuven, you know, these folks who were really torn with their faith throughout their lives, and they performed conviction. And their songs sound convicted in a way that, you know, in a didactic sense, we listen to them, we're like, oh, they believe, they know, they're you know, I know I am, I feel I am, you know, great glory in my soul, that sort of thing. Like that is, fundamentally it is a performance of faith. And you know, obviously the very best sacred music is that, I think, well, among the best sacred music, or one of the best strains of sacred music, is that which is, you know, you kind of know people are doing this to shore themselves up. They're singing to try to convince themselves. They know fundamentally that they're unsure. And that's what makes sacred music so exciting to me, I think, is that just the absolute, the bared humanity in it, especially when you know, when you believe in someone's artistry more than you believe in the conviction of their faith, or the faith of their conviction. It leads you into a place of, the holy doubt, right, is so beautiful and incredibly moving, and imbues the performance with a grace that I think someone who just, you know, or the music you would hear on the 700 Club doesn't, fundamentally, for all kinds of reasons. No. But yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
But getting back to what you said, yes, the singing here was, you know, I've said this sort of, you know, not entirely in jest. It sounds sort of needlessly self-deprecating, but there are so many wonderful sacred performances, particularly in, you know, on 78 RPM records or in field recordings, that, you know, folks are not great singers, but they sing in a moving way. You know, they put across the performance in a way that moves you perhaps more than a trained or confident singer would do. And I let myself, you know, I'm not a super confident singer, but I, you know, as I worked further, as the practice went on, and I started to accrue more of this material, and again, you know, given the injunction to sing, I realized that I won't say I was being called to do so, but I'd put myself in a position that I couldn't deny my responsibility to sing this stuff that I'd put together, you know? Yeah. So at that point I said, okay, yeah, I'll be the singer on this record. Which was exciting to me. I mean, it was a bit of a challenge to record it, but I felt more comfortable singing in Hebrew, certainly, than I would have done, I think, singing in English. Certainly singing these songs in English, because in Hebrew there is that space between, you know, because I don't know, because I'm extremely in doubt, because I'm extremely uncertain about my connection to the underlying concepts here and to the divinity. So to me, the Hebrew was a little bit of a hedge, but also gave me, you know, again, to sing Hebrew again was a really exciting, it reconnected me with being a kid and singing Hebrew again, you know, in the cafeteria at summer camp, and was a source of great joy. And also, and it did provide an extra level of, just that, of sort of safety, of a feeling of, you know, not being quite entirely exposed.
You took refuge in the language.
That's right.
You know, so when I last saw you, it was a couple months ago over Zoom, and you were at Will Oldham's house, and I was doing a Zoom interview with him and Matt Sweeney, and I think it was like a 45-minute interview, and I think at least a half hour of it was just them catching up and sharing like truly exciting and interesting information with each other, you know? And I was just sort of there, and it was like, this is the best. But I wasn't expecting to see you there, so it was really cool. I was like, hey, you're hanging out with Will. And he appears on this record along with some other folks. Obviously, Joan Shelley's on it. James Elkington, Spencer Tweedy. Who did you mention? Also, you said there, I think a bassist maybe that I didn't just credit.
Yeah, there's a Nick McCree, who's a fantastic jazz bassist and also other kinds of music bassist in Chicago, who's played with both Jim and me over the years. He's an old pal of Jim's.
Yeah.
And Nick and Spencer, the last time we saw them, or last time we played with them, well, before we tracked the rhythm stuff in Chicago, they were Joan's rhythm section on a tour we did in late 2019 in the Midwest. So we did like 5 shows with them.
Yeah.
And Nick was just a go-to. He's just a wonderful guy, an incredible musician. And because both he and Spencer were in Chicago, and Jim was playing a role as producer and arranger of the record, it was easy to get them together for a couple days in Chicago to do the rhythm tracks. So, and one person you don't mention, if I may, is Noah Babioff, who is an Israeli singer and songwriter, really phenomenal one, who I asked fairly early on if she wanted to contribute to this, given her being, a fluent Hebrew speaker, obviously, but a speaker of modern Hebrew and not of biblical Hebrew, but someone who ended up being a profound assistance in terms of my pronunciation, but also such a wonderful singer and someone who had maybe even less religious affiliation than I do. A lot of Israelis don't, secular Israelis grew up with very, very little Judaism. And I think I had more than she did, arguably. So for her, this ended up being, she would say, she told me that it was a very meaningful experience for her as well to kind of connect to some of this stuff that, maybe was bouncing around in her head, again, sort of in the collective unconscious, but she hadn't really engaged with. So, and she was so crucial to this in terms of my confidence. I love her contributions so much. She does all these sort of stacked Enya-like harmonies that I didn't ask for. I was just super thrilled to get. So she's really core to this too.
Yeah. So this, it's a very personal record in terms of where you're coming from, and it sounds like it was at least when it started more of a solitary experience. How did it feel to open the record up to other players and other collaborators?
Yes, that was the idea. I knew that I didn't want it to be a solo record in any meaningful way. And part of it, again, was, I wanted the practice was by its nature solitary, but I wanted the finished product to be the manifestation of my people, I say this sort of laughingly, but of kind of a congregation, whereas, 10 men or 10 individuals in Judaism make a minyan, which means you can have a Torah service. And I kind of felt like these folks were my minyan, some very, very dear friends, some people that I actually still have not met in person, but that Jim brought in as contributors, such as the trumpet player Stephen Burns in Chicago, but folks who kind of got what I was doing. And it became, a real experience of fellowship. And certainly, I had the group singing in some places was, an intention of mine very early on that I wanted again to, sort of not reproduce, but to experience again the feeling of singing collectively some of this material or some of this, this material, the spirit of this material, the sort of the spiritual aspects, singing in group harmony or in group unison as we do, is I think the way a lot of this stuff should be done. So, or a way that I've experienced or enjoyed so much sacred music too, especially in terms of, say, gospel quartets or sacred harp singings or whatever it is. So recreating some of that was really crucial to me. And I ended up with I feel like everyone who was involved really brought their, or at least all my friends who were involved were really excited about the idea. They knew that I felt very committed to it. So it felt like I had a super, super solid team, who understood the intentionality of the project.
I've interviewed Will Oldham a few times, and I really like the way that he talks about God. I think when I first interviewed him for Aquarium Drunkard, he said something like, for better or worse, his default is to think of God as all things. So, he's great, right? So Will's like, God is the absence of God, and God is God, and God doesn't exist, so of course God exists. Like all these, I love the way he uses the word, right? The idea to sort of encompass everything. I wonder, as you're engaging with this thought of the higher power or a higher power, you've mentioned that your practice is a modified and sort of individualistic one. I wonder, how do you conceive of God as you're working on this album? And did you end up finishing the process with different thoughts in your head than you started?
I definitely would not disagree with Will's reading on the God issue. I mean, the most important prayer in Judaism is the Shema, which is sort of the watchword of the faith, the declaration of monotheism. And it says in translation, hear, O Israel, hearken to, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And that sense of the oneness of the unity of the divine, and especially in ideas of Jewish mysticism and the idea of tikkun olam, which is the repairing of the world, is to sort of reunite the creator God, the sort of masculine attributes of God, with the Shekhinah, which is the divine presence, which were sort of disconnected at the moment of the fall, or really at the moment of the creation. And that we have a role to play in terms of making that, reconnecting, reunifying the unity, the alpha and omega, the infinitude, everything. And I have nothing less than that, certainly, is my conception of God. And so, sometimes it can be difficult in the Psalms because God is very present, and God is many times very embodied, and God is very masculine. And, it's very easy to read past some of that stuff by just thinking about the totality, about the wholeness of the divine. And especially at a time, working through the Trump era, working through COVID, feeling isolated, feeling desperate. The sense of the Psalms as being a balm, as being a way, an individual route, an individual point of access to that unity, was created for me a spiritual space that I didn't know I had access to, or that I had need for.
Yeah.
And so singing these songs, again, music has always been that for me. I mean, certainly the most spiritual zone that I can inhabit, whether as a participant or as a listener or an audience member, or a casual observer. And this has just deepened or broadened my, I guess, tool chest for that access, or my key ring. I feel like I have more doors that I can open now, for the sake of that connectivity, to the oneness that is the thing that we call God, and is nothing less than that,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's such a, there's so much encompassed in what you just said. So it's almost dizzying to wonder, all the different directions we could take the conversation, because it's such a, so much of your work. I loved the Landwork records, and I loved hearing the sort of interplay between these ancient 78s and your work, and you work with the Alan Lomax Archive. So the connection between the present and the past, or the sort of eternal present that is captured in a recording, to me, I feel like that's always played in your work, and that there's a sense of time travel, almost, of sort of this blurring between moments. And, I wonder if, when you're working with material that is historically rooted and has been approached and integrated into so many different areas of culture and of faith, and just, it's such a massive undertaking. What sense do you have as far as your relationship with time and with history when you think about this record? I mean, I can't imagine that as an archivist and a scholar the way you are, were you able to wrap your head around sort of the scope of what you were doing with this record? Or do you have to sort of shut that off and just start making the thing and let it bloom into whatever it is going to be?
Oh, that's a lot. It's a great question.
I know.
And I mean, that's everything to me. I mean, the idea of uniting the present with the past in some meaningful, productive, Walter Benjaminian way, revolutionary way revolutionary sense is very important to me. And I do think it's crucial to my experience in everything that I do as a reader, as a listener, as a writer, as a living, acting human being. Not at all to denigrate things that insist on their presentness or on their immediacy, but I don't tend to care for music that is, I won't speak in the negative. I really value things that have endured beyond their emplacements in time and in space. Yeah. Things that are able to reach us beyond, the bounds of their physicality, their mortality, perhaps their shelf life. Certainly in terms of 78s, I mean, that's one of the reasons why. The Landwork project, again, was just a total experiment, and I hadn't thought anything through really conceptually before I started it. It was just seemed like an interesting thing to do. And then as the COVID year proceeded, Landwork became all of a sudden this highly charged, super weighted experience for me that was, enabled me to burst beyond the bounds of my physical isolation in space, but also this sense of just oppressive time, the time that never seemed to change, And again, we still have an incredible physical experience out here where we live that has enabled us to, we certainly weren't stuck in an apartment in New York City like friends of mine were. But the sense that, if you are a close listener and reader of historical material, you have a key, you have a means of bursting out of your emplacements, right? Your context. And that makes you a better, bigger, I think more rigorous and more engaged person with the universe. And it certainly, it reinvigorates these things that were never meant to last or never had hope to last. And of course the Psalms, I'm sort of speaking largely about, in some cases, vernacular culture or people's history in terms of working people's history or the history of the oppressed, of the subaltern, say. And the Psalms are, Psalms are hardly folk material. The Psalms aren't forgotten material by any means, but there was a sense that this stuff could be, everything is charged with its own historicity, and it can be reintroduced into our time in really powerful ways. And again, I'm totally borrowing and ripping off and cheapening Walter Benjamin, but that idea is really powerful to me. And that's, I guess, my interest in what I do with my job and what I do as a record collector, my interest in this stuff. So that wasn't really meant to last. And yet we have both the opportunity and the privilege to reintegrate it with our experience now. And it makes everything better and bigger and more meaningful.
Well, Nathan, it's been so awesome talking with you about all this stuff. In closing, I want to ask one more monumental and insane question. Because I've just been tossing softballs at you the entire time. I know. So let's try a hard one. Moving on from God, as somebody who does preservation work and makes it, a not insignificant portion of your life has been dedicated to preserving and maintaining and helping to get these sort of ancient recordings out into the world in a way where they can be interacted with. Do you ever think or allow your mind to wander or daydream about how your recordings will live beyond you? I know that could invite a sort of like egomaniacal weirdness, but I don't think it has to. I'm curious if that's been the case for you.
Wow, I've never considered that before. I truly have never considered that before, and now I will consider it. It really hasn't. I mean, a lot of times I do think about, I'll listen to a record, listen to a 78, say, of It doesn't matter what it is, and try to imagine what it would be like if this particular singer or members of the band or whatever it is could know that this guy was standing in this barn in this place in this time, enjoying this record that someone cut and probably forgot that he or she did it 10, 15 years later, after doing so. I think about the fact that, the story about James Carter, the prisoner at Parchment, who led the singing of Poor Lazarus that was included on the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou soundtrack. So that was a Lomax recording from 59. T-Bone Burnett put it on that soundtrack, and money started rolling in. And this is right when I first started working at the Lomax Archive in 2000. I started in 2000. This happened in 2001, 2002. And Anna Lomax, Alan's daughter, had to hire an investigative reporter to track down James Carter so she could pay him the royalties that he was due. And when he was finally found, he was in a hospital in Southside Chicago, had pneumonia, I guess, slated not long to live. And his wife was found. She was the retired deacon of a storefront church. And they reached out to her and said, we have this recording. And she said, well, my husband isn't a singer. They said, well, and, sent photos, basically recreated the story. And he had no recollection of being recorded by Lomax, remembered the song, and certainly had no idea this song was on the soundtrack, no idea what the movie was. And a few days later, he was flown to the Grammys, his first plane ride, all this sort of thing. But I love thinking about, it just, if it weren't for that, one phone call, the guy might have died, and there would be no sense that what he did, that, he was able to excavate that memory and then have that memory, have it, manifest this thing far beyond his life and his context and the lives of all of these people who saw the movie and bought the soundtrack. And I love thinking about that. I love thinking about those gossamer threads that tie the past to the present and make those connections possible. Having said that, that's an absolute tangent, and I'm sorry, you're welcome to cut that out. I have not considered what this stuff would do in the future. And, in a way, I feel like, I will be overjoyed if someone 20 years from now digs this stuff up the way that people were digging up, forgotten 70s singer-songwriters or, Ethiopian band leaders who now drive cabs in DC. I would love that if this can find a life in some other place and other time, but I've never considered it actually happening. So now I will. Yeah.
Well, we'll have to touch base after you've given it time, and we'll get your complete thoughts of how your work will be appraised in the future and how it will last. We'll do a second podcast all about that. We'll sort of do write a science fiction story of how it works. I think that's probably the best way to go. So
excellent. Give me 15, 20 years.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. I'm sure the podcast will still be going in 20 years. Nathan, it's been so much fun talking with you, and this record's so beautiful, and I've been such a fan of your work. The heart and the spirit that I hear at work in your stuff is so moving and so evocative. I think I've told you before that there have been times where I've put your records on for the first time and just sort of been overtaken with emotion. And I think that comes from this deep and emotionally rooted engagement that you have in these traditions and these ideas and music from long ago. And it's been a real blast getting a chance to talk with you about not only these incredible songs, but your family and goats and all this other great stuff. So thank you for taking the time to do it. I appreciate it.
That is deeply heartening, man. I genuinely appreciate that very much. Thank you.
שיר חדש, שירו לו, שירו לו, שיר חדש, הציבו נגן ביצורה.
Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Jason Woodbury. I write, host, and produce Transmissions. Our audio is edited by Andrew Horton. Sarah Goldstein and Jonathan Mark Walls make visual elements for the show. Our executive producer is Aquarium Drunkard founder Justin Gage. If you want to support Transmissions, there are a few things you can do. One, you can leave a rating and a review wherever you listen to the podcast. So whatever your app of choice is, get in there and give us 5 stars and tell people what you enjoy about the show. This helps people discover what we're doing. We're always looking to expand and have more folks involved in these conversations. So that's one way you can help out. The other way, of course, is to check us out over on Patreon. You'll get all sorts of interesting, cool bonus stuff, a lot of bonus audio. So head over to Patreon and search for Aquarium Drunkard, and that's a way you can help us keep the servers humming. Transmissions drops every Wednesday, wherever you listen to podcasts and at Aquarium Drunkard. We'll be back next week. I'll be joined by drummer, comedian, and all-around independent rock scholar John Worster of the Mountain Goats, Bob Mould Band, Superchunk, and The Best Show. It's a great talk. I really enjoyed hanging out with John, so I think you'll dig it too. We'll be back next week. Until then, stay safe and keep cool. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Transmissions.